today's talk, I'm going to talk about different aspects of migration to Mumbai. I myself was born in Mumbai, so I'm an out migrant. And I also observed that among many of my friends, many people have left Mumbai to go to different places. Mumbai's population, the island population of Mumbai actually fell between 2001 and 11. So despite this idea that a lot of people are coming to Mumbai, actually a lot of people are now going to, Bangalore, Chennai, different cities. But there was a time, of course, when 80% of Mumbai were migrants, which means 8 out of 10 people were born outside the city. That number today is close to 40%. So in a way, when we talk about migration and Mumbai, we have to start back many hundreds of years ago to try and understand what happened to Mumbai. How did Mumbai become this extremely large city? And were there distinct phases of migration in which people came, people from different regions came, and how do we even understand this? Remember, in India, we're talking of so many religions, thousands of jatis, we're talking of different languages, and I've given 40 minutes from by Khaki to kind of cover some salient aspects of it. So obviously, I'm not going to be able to do justice about how every community landed up in Mumbai, but I'll be happy to take this in Q&A to the best of my abilities. So I've got some slides, and I'm going to share them and talk along with that. Great. So I'm calling it the Great Indian Migration Wave. This is a concept I developed in my book called India Moving, A History of Migration. And today's talk is specifically on Mumbai. And I'll start off with this picture on the left, which was from a book written in 1925. But what's really interesting, apart from the picture, is what's written below the picture. It says steam hammer, Gujarati, and Pardeshis at work. And you might think Pardeshis means either Indians who have gone abroad, because remember, today we use the word Pardesh as, there's a movie called Pardesh, when Indians go outside. Basically, NRIs are Pardesh. But in the early 20th century, Pardeshis in Bombay had a very specific meaning. They were called Pardeshi Bhaiyas, which is basically people from Uttar Pradesh. Right? So essentially what it's saying is Gujarati and Uttar Pradesh folk at work. But remarkably, the word Pardesi was used to denote a long distance migrant. Just like even today, by the way, people from Odisha, if they go to different long states like Gujarat, they call it Pardes. Right? So this idea of migration, of who you see yourself in the city, is very important. And of course, we know a lot of people from Gujarat and UP have come to Mumbai, and I'll speak about that at length. I'll also bring your attention to a very famous movie, shot many years back called Gaman, right? It stars Smita Patil, Farooq Sheikh, and it's probably the quintessential movie of migration to Mumbai. In fact, after this talk, if you're really, if your appetite is really going to understand more of migration, I would suggest, head straight to YouTube and watch the movie. It's a wonderful movie. It's a movie about a migrant from Uttar Pradesh who comes to Mumbai. By the way, it has fantastic stills of Mumbai's, many years back, about this guy who becomes a cab driver and is trying to find a foothold in the city, and all the tensions that happen. And of course, the movie ends in this very interesting point where this person does not know whether to continue in the city or not. Right? And that's often the dilemma of migration to Mumbai. Some of us have had amazing times in Mumbai. Some of us have probably not had such amazing times in Mumbai. And remember, for every person who has come to Mumbai, a lot of people have also left. Right? So as any city in the world has inflows and outflows, but what's remarkable is that the population of Mumbai many eons ago in 1660s was only 10,000 people. Right? When the Portuguese handed it over to the English, it was about 10,000 people. And today, just that island that we're seeing out here on this map, that is everything south of Thane and not Thane, is about 12 million people. Right? And what I'm going to try and point out in the next half an hour is, how did Mumbai become the 6th most populous city of the world, right? So it starts off with Tokyo, then you have Delhi, then you have Shanghai, then you have Mexico City, then you have Sao Paulo, and then at number 6 in the world today, it's Mumbai, right? So 12 million is the island plus a few millions from Thane, Bhiwandi, and what we call as the urban agglomeration, and we're close to about 20 million as a whole. But 12 million is a large number. And a lot of this happened in different phases. Did we reach 12 million in the 18th century? Clearly not. And what I'm going to try and do in the next half an hour is to take you through those important phases to say, okay, which communities came when, why did they come, where did they go, and what happened? because of those migrations. Okay, so broadly, I'm going to divide this into three phases. Okay, so I'm going to say that there was something very different between the pre-railways phase and post-railways phase. And quite obviously, that's because what the railways did when the railways were set up in the 1850s, it basically could bring people to Mumbai from very, very far off places like Uttar Pradesh. For instance, the last scene of Daman is, literally by the railway station. Probably, all the famous things about migration Mumbai, Amitabh Bachchan coming, staying on the railway platform. These are classics, legendary stories of migration. They always link to the railways. But there was no railways before 1850s. And yet the population of Bombay by then was already 200,000 people. So we want to understand a bit about that. And then I argue that for the next century after the railways, you got what I call as the Great Indian Migration Wave. What is the Great Indian Migration Wave? It's the world's largest voluntary and persistent migration stream, which is completely dominated, not completely, hugely dominated by men, which means it's not men and women moving to the city, but hugely dominated by men. And they come to the city, and not all of them settle down in the city. They work for 10, 20 years, and then they go back home, right? And in the meantime, they earn money, they save, they remit back money, and so on. So the whole purpose of this migration is to earn money, but they don't actually settle down, okay? Some of them do settle down, and that's why we see their communities all over the city. But the bulk of this migration, most people who came in this century to Mumbai actually went back after working and making a lot of money in Mumbai. As some of you know, Bombay is called the city of gold and so on. And then something different happens from 1960s onwards, which is the last 50 years, but the migration rate actually starts falling. Why? Because a lot of people are having kids in the city, and that's where the population is growing a lot, and the overall migration rate is falling. So while it was 80%, 100 years back, today's migration rate is only 40%, right? So that's how the migration things have changed. So three phases, I'm going to take you through these three phases now. So what happened before the railways? The community which we associate with Mumbai always as the indigenous community, right? So if there's any claim to an indigenous community of Mumbai, remember the word indigenous is, of course, just about a matter of centuries. We say in migration studies, as of now, virtually all of us trace our roots to Africa. Right? So when we say someone is indigenous to a place, it means were these guys coming there 10,000 years back, 1,000 years back, 500 years back? In the case of Mumbai, the Kodis, the fisher people, fisher folk are considered to be the indigenous community of Mumbai, right? Which means you have traces of this community going back many, many centuries, and centuries also before 1600s out here. Typically, we know this community still exists along many pockets of Mumbai. I am starting it at using the Kori community as a reference because, in a way, if this is considered as an indigenous community, virtually everyone else is a migrant in Mumbai or a descendant of migrant, right? So you might have been, you might be born in Mumbai, and your forefathers might have been born in Mumbai, but it will all trace back to a few centuries. In most cases, out of the 12 million people currently on the island of Mumbai, most people trace their ancestries pretty much to migrations that happened between 1860s and 1940s, right? And so that is really the spell in which a lot of migration happens. So a useful map to kind of talk about this pre-railways migration, right? So I'm not going to show you a lot of photographs. I'm going to use this map to tell you about where people were coming from. So of course, there were the Portuguese, because the Portuguese handed over the islands to the English. So there were a few Portuguese folks. There were a few English folks, of course. And of course, since the Brits ruled us, there were, of course, a lot of British folks in Mumbai, but not as many as Indians. There were always more Indians in the island of Mumbai than British. But you'll see that I've shaded some communities out here much more than other regions. And what are those regions? Those are the regions of our famous business communities of India, right? So you have the Marwadis, the Sindhis, the Punjabis, the Kutchis, the Gujaratis, Chettiars, and down south, very little presence in Mumbai. But these 4 or 5 business communities have been some of the most mobile business communities of India, and a lot of them have made money in Bombay. Many of them started coming well before the railways, most famously people from Gujarat. And of course, the community most dominant were the Parsis, but not just the Parsis who came from Navsari, Surat area, but also different Muslim migrants, the Bohras, a variety of castes and communities who migrated from Gujarat to Bombay, right? And so a lot of that is happening in the pre-railway stage. Kutchis, Sindhis, of course, as we know, I'll talk about the partition and I'll have something on Sindhis later on. And the Marwadis much later in the 19th century. But you're also talking about this because there's a whole part of the world outside the Indian subcontinent which also matters, which is the Arabian Sea world, right? And Bombay's position as a trading port means it has access to East Africa, to the Gulf, to Baghdad, right? And remember, the one of probably the richest person in 19th century Bombay is the Sassoon family, and the Sassoon family were Baghdadi Jews who had come to Bombay and settled down, right? So Bombay, in a way, is getting to be well connected to the outside world in the 18th and 19th centuries, and is drawing in a lot of merchants. It's a mercantile city based on trade, based on its dockyard building, and it's an attractive place because it's a deep sea harbor. It's a very nice place, geographically speaking, for ships to come, right? And because of this, you not only have the Portuguese, the initial Portuguese and the English, but you have a lot of people moving to Bombay. And that is why we say the first phase of migration to Bombay is pretty much from a catchment area, which is pretty much Gujarat to Bombay, that corner, and then a lot of merchants coming from this pan-Arabian Sea world. Are there a lot of Chinese folks out here in the 18th century? Not really. Are there a lot of folks from Eastern India? Are there folks from Uttar Pradesh and Bihar in 18th century Bombay? Not really. Of course, you'll always find a few people, but demographically insignificant. So we're saying that the migrations that happened to Bombay in this period are essentially from the trading communities. And why the trading communities are not others? Because these were communities where mobility was allowed. And many times, remember, mobility was not allowed cross sea, because remember, in India, a lot of communities have had a taboo of crossing the Kala Pani, right? Even when Gandhiji had to go to London, he had to plead to his community that, I'll be fine when I cross the seven seas. So Bombay was a nice location because you could continue a trade, but you also did not have to cross the proverbial seven seas. Another attractive part about Bombay was that the British set up legal courts. If you had disputes, you could settle them quickly. It became a very attractive position. And Bombay, in a way, starts displacing Surat, which, by the way, is the largest city of India, not just India, some say the largest city of the world in the 17th century. Bombay basically starts displacing Surat. So you have to understand that the migration that happens to Bombay before the railways is coming from this catchment area around Gujarat. And a lot of folks are leaving Gujarat, a lot of folks are leaving Surat and moving to Bombay. And that is why we find such an old Gujarati connection with Bombay. Right? And when the British first started doing surveys regularly in the early 19th century, not surprisingly, in the parts that they did the survey, for example, the Fort survey of 1813. Now, this is not a Bombay survey, it's just the Fort area in South Bombay. The community which was most dominant were people from Gujarat, basically the Parsis, right? You had very few English actually by then living in the fort. And then they had, 105 Armenians. Some of you might know the Armenian connection. Again, coming from trade. Portuguese, as I mentioned, Moors meaning in this case, Muslim folk. This is 1813 when Bombay's population was already more than 100,000 people. So who were the remaining 100,000 people on this island back then? They were pretty much people coming from a local catchment area, which means in parts of the Bombay presidency of that region, which means places, not Bombay presidency 1813, but in the early 19th century, the region of what we would now call as Gujarat and Maharashtra, made up Bombay of more than 100,000 people. A bit more about the Parsis, because they're probably the most famous migrant community of the 18th and 19th century. What are the Parsis doing? A lot has been written about the Parsis. Probably the most two famous in the world of business were, Jamshedji Gigi Boy. So think of JJ Hospital and all the JJ initials across city of Bombay today. And of course, J.N. Tata starting the famous Tata House. What's interesting is, when I went to Navsari some years ago, interestingly, both their houses are very close to each other, right? So if you ever go to Navsari, it's a great tourist point because you can see JJ and J.N. Tata very close by. They were both born there and they were both moved to Bombay and became some of the wealthiest people of their lifetimes, right? So that these were migrant people who made it big in the city of Bombay. And I would say probably the first people who struck gold. in the sense these were guys who made a lot of money in Mumbai at that time. Of course, you can think of a person like Dhirubhai Ambani in the late 20th century doing something similar, also moving from Gujarat and striking it big in Bombay, right? So think of J.N. Tata and Dhirubhai Ambani as three great, Gujarati folk who moved to Bombay and made it very big. Dockyards, the Wadia family, some of you might know, in the 18th century started building a lot of these ships for the British. Opium in the early 19th century was the huge buzz of the city. A lot of people across communities made money trading with China. This was Malwa opium. And by the late 19th century, cotton really takes boom after the American Civil War led boom in the early 1860s. A lot of Parsi folks, and this is key, I want to emphasize that it was Parsi folk who started the cotton textile mill industry in Bombay in a big way, right? So 1854, C.N. Dawar makes the first cotton mill. And the cotton mill is, of course, a huge part of Bombay's history because that's where the migrants start coming to, right? So when we ask this question, how does Bombay's population grow? It is not just that what the railways does is it allows people to come from further and further people, but the opium industry did not attract that many people to Bombay. It's the cotton industry which required production and labor that actually attracted people. This photograph, by the way, it says, a Parsi turning shell case. And I want to stress this because when we think of Parsis today, we always have this image of this, a community which was always maybe either very wealthy or always into philanthropy. But if you see this gentleman out here, Parsi folk, the bulk of them, of course, when they came to Bombay, came with very humble means. This is not a story of a very rich community forever. When they first came in the 18th, 19th century, they were still trying to make money at that time. The initial catchment area of migrants to Mumbai before the railways was pretty much this region that you're seeing on this map, right? Which means, as I said, Kathiawar. Now, of course, there's a famous movie, Gangubai Kathiawadi, which shows a famous migrant worker in a particular industry who moves to Bombay. You have Ahmedabad, Baroda, and then you have all these places, of the Bombay presidency like Pune, Ahmednagar, Nasik, Thana. But if there is any one place which has contributed the most to Bombay, it is the district called Ratnagiri, right? And as I pointed out in my book, Ratnagiri today is famous for mangoes. But if you think of the word mangoes, that's also what it's done, right? It just sent these people they've sent hundreds of thousands of people to Bombay and really influenced Bombay in a huge way. In fact, the Konkan region, Bombay's initial spurt of migration was almost completely driven by Konkan migration in the late 19th, early 20th century. I'll come to that in a bit, but this is just to tell you that the world before 1850s, Bombay was already becoming a city of migrants, but from a particular catchment area, which you're seeing out here, plus an international catchment area of merchants drawn from Baghdad or the Gulf world, the Arab world, or for that matter, Armenia, or for that matter, from Africa. Right? In fact, some of the first surveys of the 18th century also has a column called slaves. They were slaves, migrants who were living on the city of Bombay, right, in the island of Bombay. That kind of went out of fashion by the end of the 18th century. Now, when these migrants came, where did they live? And I'm taking here an anecdote. This is from this wonderful, Govind Narayan's Mumbai, an urban biography, a fantastic translation by Murli Ranganathan. And I'm just going to read this. Where do the migrants live in Mumbai? So this is an observation coming from the year 1863. What does Govind Narayan say? He says, though most of the settlements in Mumbai are fairly mixed, and remember, this was written in Marathi, and that's why the word Mumbai, Mumbaitsa Varnan is what the book was called. Though most of the settlements in Mumbai are fairly mixed, most people prefer to stay close to members of their own caste. If some 10 Parsis stay in an area, a Hindu would not prefer staying there. And where there may be 20 houses of the Dakshini people from the south, a couple of Gujaratis will not take up residence there. The Parsis, Musalmans, Bohras, Christians, and others also behave in the same fashion. And you see what's happening with this migration. The migration to Bombay, like most parts of the world, develops distinct quarters within the cities where people thrive. Interestingly, Govind Narayan had a very interesting observation, saying only the English are not bothered to stay amongst their own people. If they find some clean air and so on, they can take up residence in any place, right? Of course, we know the British were the experts at segregation. They had spaces for themselves, spaces for others, and so on. Terms like black town, white town were used in urban planning and so on. But this is an interesting observation from 1863 about how people lived in Mumbai at that particular point. All right, so that's just to give you a flavor of how Bombay looked like roughly circa 1850s. People from that particular catchment area I showed who had come, and a lot of them making money in opium, dock building, and related works, public administration, and so on. An interesting illustration of how people moved in those days. So how did people come before the railways to Bombay, right? And this is not a specific image of Bombay, but it shows you how people move. It shows you tramps, pilgrims, traveling beggar, a dock, elephants, horses, all sorts of animals being used to come to Bombay, and of course then taking boats to basically cross this important creeks to come on the mainland of Bombay. And then the last panel, of course, ends with the East India Railway, right? And the arrival of the railways is a huge event. When the railways was inaugurated in the city of Bombay in the Indian subcontinent, it's a huge spectacle. People have not seen a train, and it's a completely new experience for them. But what the railways does as it expands across the Indian subcontinent is that more people can come now to Mumbai, not only stay there, but go back and come again. If you were in 1800 and you were trying to make a journey to Bombay from Uttar Pradesh, well, you could come, but you would not be a regular visitor, right? You could not be a migrant worker, you could not keep connections back home. The railways enabled all of that. The railways now could enable a migrant worker to go to Mumbai, earn some money, and go back and come again. So the frequency of these visits started coming. But what I want to emphasize is the image which is not there in the picture, that is steamers, right? And by the late 19th century, steamboats started coming into play. And a lot of people who came to Bombay were actually not coming by the train, even when the train was built, but by steamers, especially from the Konkan region, right? So it was so much, in fact, migration of labor from the Konkan region via steamers that by the 1930s, there was in fact some litigation or a complaint saying that, look, from the Konkan, these guys are packing these steamers, but we also have to ship our mangoes. As you know, people in Bombay love their mangoes. And so there was this whole competition between how many passengers should we put on the steamers and how many mangoes should we put on the steamer. Right? So literally the mangoes and the men were kind of competing for space on the steamers from Ratnagiri to Mumbai. People from Ratnagiri, before the buses started, came on steamers. And that is why I say this again, that most people who came to Bombay came until maybe the 1930s actually came by steamers, either from abroad or from along the coastline. And of course, the train started increasing, drawing migrants from the inland more and more after that. Now, I'm going to give you, I'm going to show you some migrants, right? So who are these migrants? This is a gentleman we interviewed in Konkan, in the Ratnagiri. This is a photograph taken in the late 20th century. But it's interesting because this photograph was taken in Chembur. He did all his life working in the informal sector. He retired back in Ratnagiri. His life story is very simple in the sense he grew up, he moved from Ratnagiri to Bombay. He worked in Bombay all his life, and then he went back to Ratnagiri. And then his son, pictured in this photograph, also went to Bombay, whereas all the women in this photograph did not go to Bombay except for kind of a vacation where they took this photograph. Right? So when they took this photograph, the women were there, but otherwise the women were back home. And what are they doing back home? They're looking after the house, the land, the children, and so on. And this is the prototype migrant family, which has sent out hundreds and hundreds of thousands of people to Bombay, not just from Ratnagiri, but also from Uttar Pradesh, from a variety of places in India. This is another family, a photograph taken in Shivaji Park, and the older gentleman out there and the man and the woman both came from Udupi, right? So Udupi, all of you know because of the famous Udupi restaurants in Bombay, and all the communities that come from there, the Shettis and so on. This photograph happens to be my own family photograph. This is my grandfather and grandmother taken. I was born in Shivaji Park, pretty much in a clinic opposite or very close to this building. What's interesting is that this is a very rare case of migration from Udupi to Bombay, where the people actually did not go back to Udupi, right? Because most people who came from Udupi or Konkan or Uttar Pradesh worked for some time and then went back. So there are two kinds of families. some who come to Bombay and settle down, and some who come to Bombay and then eventually go back, right? And for a longest time, the second kind of family dominated, which means people actually never settled down in Bombay, right? Why? Because maybe it was too expensive, or they treasured being back home, or it was taboo for women to migrate, huge taboo for women to migrate in many places. So this is a rare family which settled down, and that's why I was born in Mumbai and not born in Udupi, though many of his peers would have eventually gone to Udupi and their kids would have been born. Right? This phenomenon of especially male migration is captured in this chart of sex ratios. The x-axis is all the census years from 1901 to now, and the y-axis is sex ratio. And this is one of the world's, not just India's, remarkable phenomenon of what I call the missing men. Ratnagiri and Udupi for more than 100 years have basically had female surpluses in their districts. Why? Because the men were outside, and where were they? They were in the city of Bombay. Right? So you see, this is a sex ratio of females per males, but when you flip it, what you get is that Mumbai is essentially a masculine city until the 1960s, 1970s. It still has a sex ratio which is adverse, but not as bad as it was 100 years back. In 1901, Mumbai and Calcutta sex ratio was about 500 to 600 females to 1,000 males. Right? You understand that's essentially saying men dominate the city. And of course, that has huge consequences in terms of how public spaces are invented, created, and so on. So this second phase of migration to Bombay, the first phase, the sex ratios are fairly balanced. For instance, if you saw the first census of Bombay in the early 19th century, they're fairly balanced. There's no stark difference. But by the time you come to the early 19th century, something completely is different. So from phase one to phase two, not only is the catchment area changing, but also the entire gender composition of these migrations are changing, right? And so Mumbai and Calcutta become these male cities in this area. And where are they coming from? Right? And this is probably, if there's anything you want to take away from this talk, it is this one chart. This is the chart of migration to Bombay, right? This is how Bombay draws migrants from all over India. It's data from the census in the 1990s, but it's pretty accurate for even the 1960s. So Mumbai, as you know, is on the western coast. All the red shaded districts are very high out migration districts to Bombay in particular. And the ones in thatched, the red crosses are extremely high out migration to Bombay. So what do you see in this map? It shows that Bombay actually gets very few migrants from northeast of India. The yellows are basically where very few people send the people to Bombay, right? The Mumbai gets very few people from Jammu and Kashmir. But Mumbai gets a lot of people from Gujarat, right? Especially Kutch. Mumbai gets a lot of people from its immediate hinterland, especially the Konkan region. And Mumbai gets a lot of people from that one district in Karnataka called Udupi, which you see out here. Mumbai gets a lot of people from this one district out here in Tamil Nadu, right? Then a few places of Andhra Pradesh, and then very few people from Madhya Pradesh, and then all over from eastern Uttar Pradesh and Bihar. Right? It's not all of Uttar Pradesh, it's just a particular cluster, Uttar Pradesh, districts like Jaunpur, Azamgarh, and so on. What explains this map? Why is it that Mumbai gets migrants from such places? A lot of theories have been advanced. Very simply put, as I mentioned, the initial catchment area was already set in place before 1860s, but then over time, certain networks developed. So from Udupi, for instance, a lot of people got into the restaurant business. And that is why you have this Udupi, the South Indian restaurant business of Bombay owes its genesis to this migration wave. Why did it start? Most likely due to a flood. That's often the origin stories of many of these communities. There was a famine or a flood or an earthquake and people started moving. But as some people start moving to the city, they create a foothold, and then the next person comes, stays with them, and so on. What is called as chain migration. That is why, though Madhya Pradesh is much closer to Mumbai, many more migrants come from UP and Bihar than from Madhya Pradesh. Now, why UP and Bihar? Partly because population density is very high. A lot of people come from there. But also because this place has been sending out migrants, not just to Mumbai, but around the world. Fiji, the indentured labor migrations that was also the recruitment. So that was a classic labor recruitment area, which created its networks in Bombay's textile industry in particular. Okay, there are also other districts like in Rajasthan and so on. I just point out the Kerala connection. Today, as you know, a lot of people from Kerala go to the Gulf. You'll be surprised to know how that connection actually started in the city of Bombay. The first recruiters of those petroleum companies in the Gulf countries in the early 20th century came to Bombay and recruited people, especially Christians and Muslims, who are mostly people from Kerala, many people are from Kerala, to work in the Gulf. And it is those contractors who then went to Kerala directly to recruit people that created this massive Kerala to Gulf connection that we see. So you can see also how migration builds these networks, right? So you have Bombay, but then you have all these other networks also emerging because of that. Okay, just to show you how Bombay is different from other cities of India, Bombay draws people from virtually every part of the country. That is not true, for instance, of Delhi, which draws people mainly from its Hindi-speaking heartland. It is not true of Calcutta, which draws people only from one small part of India. It is not true of Surat, which draws people from some parts of India, but most parts blank, right? So that is why we say Bombay is unique among cities of India, the most cosmopolitan, the place where you'll find the most linguistic diversity. Marathi is not the dominant, has never been the dominant language of the city of Bombay. All of this is because of the way these migration patterns emerged in the late 19th and early 20th centuries, which, by the way, still exist even today. Okay, the industry which really changed the fortunes of Bombay was textiles, right? And there's some images. The one below is, of course, of a dilapidated textile mill. The one on the left is of a cotton trading market. Cotton textiles was the big deal, and where did these guys come from? The table on the right gives you some idea. Most of these guys came from Ratnagiri, right? So let's look at these numbers. The numbers suggest about half of the migrants in the cotton textile industries in 1911 were from Ratnagiri, but something happened between 1911 and 1931. Basically, people from Uttar Pradesh, Bihar started dominating. You can see how United Provinces or Uttar Pradesh, that number goes up from 3% to 11%. There's some other districts like Satara, Kolaba, which is also Konkan, Pune, Kolhapur, Ahmednagar, but Ratnagiri is the biggest of them, right? And that is why it is such a big reason. I should also point out the remarkable connection of Ratnagiri and Bombay. Dadar and Borivali, which are two famous stations of Bombay, are also names of villages in Ratnagiri, right? And so a lot of people have asked me, which way did it come? Did the names come from Ratnagiri or did the names go to Ratnagiri? In my view, most likely the names went to Ratnagiri, right? But it's a really interesting kind of thing that you'll find a lot of the names of Bombay also, a lot of the names of Bombay, the neighborhood names of Bombay come because of the migrants, right? Like a Sindhi colony, for instance, right? But a lot of the names of Bombay have also gone back to those regions. I think that is also very interesting. Okay, the place of origin, you'll see so many people coming from
the migrants
of different regions of India. Another thing that the cotton textile industry does in terms of caste composition is that suddenly you also have an inflow of what was earlier known as untouchables, today Dalits, outcasts. The share in Bombay's population in 1870, for example, was 4%, but because the textile industry gives an opportunity for many people to work across castes, a lot of people from historically marginalized castes start coming to Bombay. This is an underappreciated fact of Bombay's changing demography, right? So for example, in just the textile industry, it goes from less than 1% to 13% in about 70 years, right? And that's the kind of changing demography of Bombay's population. Not surprisingly, a lot of these people after Ambedkar's exhortation in the 1950s switched to Buddhism. That is why today, by the way, Buddhism accounts for 5% of Bombay's population, 2011 census, right? This was all of this migration happened because of the cotton textile industry, providing job opportunities to a variety of castes. Of course, while we say mostly men came, it's not that women did not come, right? And a lot of the women also work in the cotton textile industry. Right? A nice photograph of women mill hands working in Bombay. The other big industry which employed women and which continues to employ women in Bombay is, of course, the house care industry, right? So domestic help, a huge industry of Bombay, employed the women's share in that is, obviously dominant, and that has been a huge source of when women migrants come to the city, often they end up working in domestic help and other places. Just a photograph of how migrant workers would live. This is all pictures from 1925 or so. Of course, not great housing structures provided for them. This is the same chart I showed in the beginning, Gujarati and Pardeshis at work. This is a nice image of mostly migrant workers out here at the GIP railway works, right? So one of the largest railway companies of India, basically what we would call as our central line today, not the western, but the central line. So when we say that 80% of Bombay 100 years back was migrant, virtually everyone was a migrant, right? And that's what the city was. Today, when we say 40% of the city is migrant, most people in Bombay today are actually born in Bombay. This was not the case 100 years back, right? And that is what has changed dramatically in the last 50 years. Okay, I'll just close this kind of sequence on the second phase of migration by pointing out where people stayed in Bombay. Okay, and it's very simple. You'll see the black dots in this map. All the black dots in this map represent cotton mills, right? So these are cotton mills of Bombay. And then there's a huge congested area marked in black, which is what we call as, the market area and so on, with population densities extremely high. And then you'll see circles, white circles on the map. Those are where the chawls were built by the Bombay Improvement Trust, right? So you'll see a lot of the migrant labor population of Bombay settled down in this area, pretty much out here south of the mills. And of course, the Parsis, the English back then, a lot of the Bombay's elite back then and now were living in more South Bombay time, right? This was when the Bombays, if you look at the Bombay as entire island, South Bombay basically, most of the Bombay island people lived in South Bombay. That's not true anymore. Basically today, if you look at Bombay island map, the entire island, about 75% of people now live north of Mahim, right? That was not the case earlier, where over 75% of people lived south of Mahim. So that tremendous shift happened in the last 50 years, where whoever came to Bombay were no longer taking up residences here. They were now living north of Mahim. And most importantly, people from this part of Bombay, which is south of Mahim, also started moving north of Mahim, going to places in the suburbs. And of course, the most recent phase going to Navi Mumbai, Thane, and places outside. So these are just some statistics, 80% migration rates 100 years back. Today, it's at about 40%. Just to give you a sense of what these numbers mean, right? These are kind of how many people were coming to Bombay in these decades. One decade in which migration took a real beating was the 1920s. Why? Because in the 1929, 1930, there was a Great Depression shock. The global economy tanked and a lot of people left Bombay. So it's not just a story of people coming to Bombay. There have also been times when people have left Bombay. And the Great Depression, very few people came to Bombay in that decade. And of course, there's been a decade where a lot of people came to Bombay, which was the 1940s, because of partition, when about 100,000 people came from the just created Pakistan to Bombay. Unlike Delhi or Calcutta, where the partition influx was much larger, for instance, partition refugees became over half the population of Delhi. It wasn't as large for Bombay, but still, about 100,000 people, what we call as a Sindhi population now, relocated to Bombay, right? And that's why you got a huge influx. Now, suppose you take a number like in the 50s of 600,000 people, net migrants, that is people coming in and going out, the net effect. What does that mean on a per month or per day basis? It's basically saying 60,000 people were being added in a year in the late 19th century. That's about 200 migrants every day, right? And that number is now about double or treble. So what we're seeing is that Bombay today gets about 500, if you go to the airports, railway stations, bus stands, cars, there are people entering the city and there are people leaving the city. What's the net effect, right? It's about, well, in this case, it was about 200 people, but today it's about more than 500. More than 500 people come every day to Bombay, right? And you can imagine the kind of resources that are required for that. Last chart, and then I'll move back to some pictures. This is work from Mekhala in Pune, who's a student in Pune, which just shows you about Bombay's changing composition of people, right? And I want you to focus on the top colors, which is in pink and violet. It's basically about how many people are coming from distant locations, inter-province or interstate. In 1881, only 9% of people came from very, very far off areas. In 2011, that number is 27%. So almost 1/3 of migrants in Bombay in 2011 are coming from places like UP, Bihar, what we would call as interstate migration. And a lot of this, by the way, happened between 1881 and 1931. It moved from 9 to 25%, and then much later, it went up and again came down. So it's kind of stabilized at this 27% number, right? Though the overall migration rate has gone. So this UP, Bihar, West Bengal, Odisha influx into Mumbai is pretty much a last 50-year phenomenon. Now, one of the stereotypes of migration is that we associate migrants from a particular region with certain kinds of work, right? And you can actually see that in some of the information put out. This is data from 1960s. So migrants who came from Maharashtra to Mumbai, that is outside Mumbai, in Maharashtra to Mumbai, about 30% of them worked in textiles. People who came from Gujarat, well, actually very few in textiles, 40% were in commerce, which means retail and wholesale trade. It makes sense, Gujaratis were doing business. When you look at Mysore, which is now Karnataka, and Kerala, about a third of them were working in the service profession, right? So these are stereotypes, because remember, these communities were heavily dominating the secretarial professions, administrative professions, and so on. Interestingly, people from Andhra Pradesh, one connection of Andhra Pradesh, of course, a very old connection, which is linked with the place in Mumbai now called Kamatipura. But later on, you'll see textile manufacturing was huge, 32% of migrants from Andhra Pradesh working textile. But Andhra Pradesh migrants in Mumbai occupied a very niche position in the construction sector, right? And about 16% of them are working construction, much, much more than any other state. And that is how these links were formed, right? As migrants came, they specialized in particular sectors, and then they got their people to work typically in the same sector. So if you're a Gujarati who comes to Bombay and starts off a particular trade, you get other Gujarati folks to work in similar trades. And that is how Bombay's kind of diverse links today represent the various sectors that initial migrants got into, right? And so UP, Bihar are hugely into textile because of a lot of Muslim weavers who had migrated in the late 19th century, early 20th century. Interestingly, West Bengal, metal and chemical-based manufacturing. We forget now how important this industry has been for Bombay. It's typically, opium, textiles, and now finance and services. But metal and chemical manufacturing used to employ about 20% of all migrants in Bombay. It's a very important part of Bombay's migration and occupational history. All right, how did this affect religion? Well, some religions that you should know, for example, Parsis. Recent migration has meant that the Parsi dominance of the city has fallen, right? So Parsis were there in fairly large numbers in relative terms 150 years back. Today, less than 1% of population. It was about 6% of the population in 1901. There are more Jains today, about 4% of population Jains, and the share of Christians has also fallen. Bombay has also had a huge connection to Goa. Today, of course, a lot of people from Bombay just want to run away to Goa. But 100 years back, people from Goa were running away to come to Bombay, right? And Goa, like the Konkan, sent out a lot of people, especially working in bakeries and cooking and a lot of sectors like that. Some other migrants which we are accustomed to when we talk about Bombay, but in a very different light. These migrants were not coming voluntarily. Often they were forced to move, right? And three very specific communities were the Baghdadi Jews, the Sassoon family, for instance, who got linked with trade and philanthropy. The very famous Iranis who started these Irani cafes, right? This is again late 19th, early 20th centuries. And a lot of these guys were, escaping basically and starting afresh out here. The Iranis, not to be confused with the Parsis. Parsis is a very different stock. And the Iranis, of course, very famous in Bombay because of the Irani cafes. All over South Bombay, of course, a lot of them are now slowly shutting down, unfortunately. And then the Sindhis, because of the partition, there's a influx of about 100,000 Sindhis at one go. That's a one-time shock that happens to Bombay's thing. And you'll see that all these three influxes have kind of enriched Bombay in different ways. The Iranis and cafes, Baghdadi Jews and philanthropy, think of the Sassoon Library, and the Sindhis, of course, in trade and real estate. There's a little known category called famine refugees. If you look at Bombay's history of who was coming to the city, before, say, the 1920s, a lot of these guys were coming to escape the countryside famines and try and find some food in Bombay. So that is also a particular category of distress-driven migration that led people to Bombay. This is just to show you where the Sindhi colonies of Bombay are. You can actually do this, go to Google Maps and just type in, say, Udupi or type in certain words, and you can see very quickly where the locations are. All of you, I think, who are based in Bombay know the Chembur Sindhi camp, which is a huge part of the relocation, but the biggest part of the relocation happened in Ulhasnagar, which is actually outside the municipal limits of Bombay. Okay, now this is just to give you a sense of the people who came to Bombay at different times, what they did. But there were at least two reasons which often made life for migration or migrants in Bombay very difficult, right? One is, of course, politics. And the first big anti-migrant politics started in the 1960s. This is a newspaper headline from the Times of India, 1967. It says, South Indians in Bombay feel insecure, report MPs. In fact, some families were so insecure that we changed our surnames. My surname, for instance, Tumbe, sounds Maharashtrian, but it actually refers to a town in Udupi. And our surname was changed in the 1960s to sound more Maharashtrian, right? So my surname itself reflects a lot of this thing about migration and identity in the city of Bombay. And then more recently, in 2000, suddenly the ire of many political parties switched towards migrants, not from South India, but migrants from North India, right? So you'll see in the 1960s, the anger was against South Indians. Why? They were taking jobs in clerical professions and so on, service jobs. By 2008, the ire had kind of moved towards the North Indians, people from UP, people from Bihar. In this case, the Times of India headline says, now Bal Thackeray trains guns on Lalu, right? These are actual headlines taken from newspapers. What I want to stress is that despite a lot of anti-migrant rhetoric in Bombay for a long time, and much more compared to most other cities, for example, there's been very less rhetoric in relative terms in Calcutta. And yet, Calcutta's migration rate started plummeting across the 20th century, whereas Bombay's has held fairly high even today. Today, Calcutta is less than 20% or so. Bombay is still at 40%. What I'm trying to point out is that despite the anti-migrant rhetoric, Bombay has still managed to attract migrants throughout, because a lot of the politics was at the level of rhetoric rather than reality. So often before elections, politicians would make a noise saying we need sons of the soil, we need jobs for locals, but often they would not be anything more than that. And the classic way to see this is, of course, is the movie called Thackeray, right? So after you've seen Gaman, which will tell you something about migration to Bombay, you should watch Thackeray. And what's remarkable about this movie is that this is, of course, the life of Bal Thackeray, is who plays Bal Thackeray in this movie, right? And this is no one but Nawazuddin Siddiqui. And Nawazuddin Siddiqui is, of course, a migrant worker from Uttar Pradesh, right? Which again tells you to see that when it comes to actual reality, the anti-migrant rhetoric is often toned down, right? They didn't choose a Maharashtrian protagonist to play Bal Thackeray. They actually chose a migrant worker from Uttar Pradesh, Nawazuddin Siddiqui, to play this movie. And that is the crux of how people have viewed migration in Bombay. Despite the rhetoric, the political reality has always understood the logic of migration, that it's important to thrive the city's economy and so on. The other reason, of course, why migration has often been dented from Bombay is the pandemic. And we saw these crazy scenes of migrant workers walking out of our city last year. Well, guess what? It happened 100 years back as well. When the plague arrived in Bombay in 1897, there was a massive exodus. These are very strikingly similar visuals, but they both represent migration away from the city because of a pandemic. Right? So both plague back then and the coronavirus in our time period have affected migration in specific ways. So with that, I'll end. I've hopefully given you a flavor of some aspects of migration to Bombay, phases of migration, just how important. To give you an example, in American history, most people who trace their ancestry today in America trace their ancestry to a particular phase of migration which happened between 1870 and 1914. This is where about 40 million Europeans moved to the US. It's not the slavery migration. It's not 18th, 19th, early 19th century migration. It's a particular phase of migration which transformed USA. For example, Donald Trump's grandfather, Frederick Trump, moved from Germany to the USA in the early 20th century. And in Bombay, most of us actually trace our ancestry to a particular phase of migration, what I call as the Great Indian Migration. So whether you think of popular outlets like the Udupi South Indian eating restaurants or the Malwani restaurants that you see, or the Gujarati Thali places that you see, a lot of this was built in Bombay in this particular critical century between 1860s and 1950s and so on. After the 1950s, migration rates have actually fallen in Bombay. And overall, the city's population is now stabilizing, so much so that if you're living in Bombay, it's quite likely that you were born in Bombay, because now 60% of people actually who living in Bombay were born in Bombay. This was not the case 100 years back. And that is why understanding where we come from in Bombay is always a very interesting topic. So I'll stop here. These are two books I've written, and be happy to take some Q&A and especially talk about communities which I have not talked about, or any other questions that you may have. Thank you.
So I have there's a question as to what happened to places like Ratnagiri, from where people came away from. Was there a loss of enterprise or business there because too many people came here, or is it that they just had surplus people?
Yeah, so it's a good question about why Ratnagiri, why not someplace north of Mumbai and so on. Ratnagiri's out-migration stream starts before Bombay. So Bombay just happens to be a destination which comes in the light of the migrant worker from Ratnagiri. But overall, so if you read my book, I have a whole section on this. It starts off with actually the Maratha Empire, right? So a lot of the people are actually soldiers in the Maratha Empire's armies, right? And that is why they are traveling all the time, because they are fighting these wars. So we are talking of the 18th and early 19th century. And that is why, by the way, a lot of these people joined the Bombay police. That is how the connection starts, because a lot of the Bombay police is Marathas from Konkan. That's the link. And that link starts from the middle of the 19th century. Once that migratory current had started, a particular set of factors in the late 19th century seems to be at work. One is famines. Of course, famine is a classic push factor, but many places had famines in India. Why did the network develop in particular out here? It's because in particular lines of work, like in the textile mills that were emerging, this labor was seen to be, a cheap source of labor for the mill owners in Bombay at that particular point of time. And because it was fairly close by, they could go by the steamer, come back, and precisely they were not giving up business or enterprise, because these were mostly people living off the land. Right? So we're talking of people who were farming, or tenants, or landless people also moving to Mumbai. And as I pointed out, that Dalit entry, for instance, a lot of people were making a choice. When we talk about Bombay's poverty, for instance, that poverty has to also be seen in relative sense. People were often making rational choices that I don't mind living in a horrible, a settlement structure in Bombay, but it's still better from where I'm coming from. Right? And that is what justifies a lot of these migrations. We often think about, why would people live if you go to Konkan today, you would think it's the most pristine land. Why would any rational person leave this beautiful place with so many mangoes and then come and live in these small places, small, squatter settlements in Bombay? But the answer is economic opportunity, and the networks that were formed out there. Then there's peer pressure. You see all your friends who are going out there, so you also feel like going out there. Just like many of the people in the audience, I'm sure, have either gone abroad to study or going to send their kids abroad to study. It's just a thing that comes about in certain social circles. So if you're growing up in Ratnagiri, you see your elder brother or your chacha going to Bombay, you also want to go to Bombay. And then you hear about things about Bombay. There's the attraction of Bombay and so on. Not surprisingly, a large part of public administration, apart from textiles, is also starts employing people from Ratnagiri. So it's not like they gave up the riches. They were actually moving in search of better economic opportunities. A lot of them got them. A lot of them did not get it and also moved back to Ratnagiri. And that's why I want to harp this, that most people in that particular phase who came to Bombay left Bombay. This is a kind of myth we have that most people who come to the cities stay there. No, most people who came, especially in that era, actually left Bombay. But some of them settled, and that's why we have that large population now.
Where did they come from, and what happened to them? Did they did they get absorbed into the society? That was a curious.
Yeah, it's a good question. We're talking about relatively early, 18th century. I'm not an expert on this, but my sense is that a large part of that slave trade was coming from Africa, which is what we call as the Abyssinians. So, for example, the descendants of Malik Ambar, some of them were freed, some of them were, are still being employed as slaves. Some of them, it could well be that there were some Indian slaves, but my guess is that the few records, firstly, they're not large numbers. So Bombay Island, the numbers we're seeing is in like double digit and so on. But for me, it's interesting that they actually had a census form, some sort of a census form, which had a category called slaves. And of course, I think it's a great research topic, slaves of Bombay, who they were and what. I've not really seen research on these lines. But we know for sure that, slavery started ending in the early 19th century. And, we don't really have categories like slaves in the 20th century, for sure.
So Pooja had a question because she wanted to know about the Armenian connection, but she got two answers from the audience. Commander Mohan Narayan mentioned that Armenians in India is a book by Mr. Jacob Seth, and has an entire chapter on the Armenians in the city. And Farooq gave a reply that there was a previous talk on Armenians in Bombay by Jason Johns, and it's available on Khaki's YouTube channel. But please go ahead and share something on that as
well. Yeah, I mean, on Armenians, I think we'll go to the next question, because I think that's the best way. I mean, there's a fair amount now written on the Armenians, but as you should point out, the leading centers, the cities of India, were diverse in that time period, internationally diverse. You have the Afghani traders, in Delhi and so on. You have these Chinese folks in Calcutta. Of course, you have a few Chinese people in Bombay as well. But this is an incredibly diverse world brought about precisely by the British Empire, because there are these trading links that are created, connecting large parts of the world in the 19th century. So you'll find, merchants across different streams. But the ones which strike it big in Bombay is the Baghdadi Jewish community. Of course, it's a tiny community, right? But the Sassoon family is like the first family, one of the first families of Bombay in the 19th century. A lot of the cotton mills, by the way, I just tweeted a list of the 10 largest companies of India in 1921. And the third company, even higher than any of the Tata firms in 1921, was E.D. Sassoon United Mills, which was Bombay Cotton Mills, and there was another Sassoon Cotton Mills. It's that large. They were that large, a Baghdadi Jewish kind of enterprise which had come to Bombay and done that. So I think more than the Armenians, the Baghdadi Jews struck gold. I don't think the equivalent examples of Armenians compared to, say, Parsis and Baghdadi Jews.
Farooq has a question. Was there a significant movement of migrants from Punjab and Sindh area of what is now Pakistan towards Bombay, or was it overshadowed by the Konkan to Mumbai numbers? I think I think
Farooq's question, two parts. One is, are we looking post 1947 or before? I think probably the question is pre 1947. Pre 1947, some Punjabi migration, but not too much. Of course, very consequential in two places of Bombay. One is that the Mahindras come to Bombay, and a large part of Kandivli and so on is the Mahindra plant. So that's a huge part of the Punjabi connection, Punjabi Khatri family, which makes it big in Bombay. The other Punjabi connection of Bombay, of course, Bollywood, right? And that's a huge part of Bombay's story, which I did not mention, but that's the Punjabi connection. I've written about that in my book. And that starts before partition, and partition kind of bolsters that because there are more migrants who move because of that. So Bollywood is kind of the result of Punjabi migration. In fact, this was something I used to always think when I was small, why do these guys have Punjabi names in so many Bollywood films? It just seems, the whole Bollywood culture seems to be Punjabi. And that's because of this migration, correct? But demographically speaking, tiny, right? So Punjab never features high on the list of where people are coming to Mumbai from. But it's sectorally, they strike it big in that one, film industry. Konkan migration has, throughout the 20th century, the Konkan migration swamps everything else. I mean, that's the biggest flow. Of course, the partition, then is the Sindh migration, right? And then, because Bombay-Karachi links were always there pre-1947, but after the number is about 100,000. So about 100,000 people are relocated to Bombay, which is a tiny number compared to how many people go to Delhi and Calcutta and so on. I mean, Delhi, in a way, as a large city, is formed because of partition migrants. There's no doubt about that. That's not the case with Bombay. But again, in my book, I mentioned, some of these early Sindhi migrants. And one famous one is, of course, the House of Motwane, Chicago radio. That's the classic one. Enterprising Sindhi entrepreneur who strikes it big in Bombay. And of course, one of his descendants is now this Vikramaditya Motwane, who makes nice movies.
Now that you're talking about the Konkan Brahmins, Bharat has an observation that non-Brahmins from Konkan have kept their relations with their ancestral villages even after migrating to Mumbai a few generations ago, while the Brahmins from the same region have rarely kept their connections with their villages, like Girangao versus Girgaon mentality. Is this something that you've analyzed?
Yeah, great question. And I have analyzed actually. So we have a paper called, we studied one village called Kunkeri in Ratnagiri. And it's a paper called, the migration from Kunkeri. We looked at what happens in this village across 50 years, right? And like you pointed out, the Brahmins were the first to leave, and they're the only.
Can everyone else mute themselves, please? Thank you.
So the Brahmins are the only ones who leave and also sell off property much more than the others. So you're right that, that connection was snapped. So empirically, what you're saying is absolutely true. Of course, there can be a few Brahmins who have connections and, land still out there, but you're right that the Marathas are more likely to possess land back home and not let go of it, right? So we see that in our data as well. We don't see that, by the way, among Mahars or the Dalit community of Konkan, which means like the Marathas, the Mahars have gained tremendously from the migrant connection to Bombay. They have this, we documented substantial upward mobility on a variety of things. The land redistribution has not happened, so the Marathas are still the dominant landed community of the Konkan region. But as to why this, if you ask a specific question about Brahmins and Marathas, it's a feature observed across India, where Brahmins were very quick to move to cities and get urban professions. Right? That is why the urbanization rate among Brahmins is close to 50% today, right? Whereas among many other castes and communities, it's closer to 20-25%. So that shows you that Brahmins have made the move from villages to cities earlier and got the establishment much earlier. I would argue that there's a longer history to this, where certain social groups of India have been much more mobile than others. This is an argument I make in my book. That is, for example, Brahmins, Kshatriyas, Vaishyas have historically been much more mobile in India, and that's why I have much more diverse connections, and are hence able to settle in newer places quicker than other communities, right? And that is why, that might explain as to why in Tamil Nadu, in the Konkan, often this permanent migration has happened, whereas in other communities, temporary or semi-permanent migration has happened. A lot of this is also about people who settle down in Mumbai have certain social capital or economic capital to begin with, right? Otherwise, it's tough. I mean, the saying in the Konkan is Jechi Kholi Techi Mumbai. That is, if you have a room in Bombay, that city becomes yours, but most people can't afford it, right? And that is why you have to keep going back to the Konkan. So to settle down, you need to have arrived, in the sense you need to have had certain amount of money. And I do think the Brahmins had an advantage to a certain extent, and that's why they've been able to make the permanent move much more than the Marathas or the Mahars from the Konkan. So I think that is what seems to be going on in the Konkan as well.
Pooja made an observation that when you showed the dipping migration ratio of women, that was probably why sanitation and hygiene for women is practically minuscule in the city.
Absolutely. I mean, Bombay was built in the early 20th century for men, right? In the sense, and it's a subtle point, because this was not the case before 1860s. It changes. Before 1860s, it's a balanced city. But after 1860s, this whole, that map I showed you, the cluster, of South Bombay along the cotton mills, that is just men, right? And that is why the whole thinking of public space is also men. Right? And similarly in Kolkata, jute mills in Kolkata, and so on. So that's a huge kind of thing that opens out in Bombay. The sex ratio starts stabilizing only when there's a lot of natural increase within the island city.
Radhika Pothagle has a question about the Baha'i connection to Mumbai. Is that something that you would?
Sorry?
Baha'i connection to Mumbai.
I'm afraid I don't know much about that.
So I think Bharat and a few other people mentioned.
I mean, if others know more about this, you can, answer.
Bharat mentioned that, looking at migration now, Bangalore seems to be catching up with Mumbai in terms of the number of people who are moving.
Yeah, I mean, I'll state it very frankly. Bangalore will cross Bombay's population in a few decades, right? So that's a guarantee. You can take it in writing from me that Bangalore will become India's first or second largest city. Right now, Delhi is largest city of India. If you combine everything around it, like Gurgaon and so on. As per the UN, the second largest city of the world is Delhi, after Tokyo. So Bangalore is growing so fast that it will take at least maybe 20 to 30 years, but it will cross. It will first, of course, surpass Calcutta, and then it will surpass Bombay. So yeah, this is Bangalore's century, no doubt about
it. Commander Mohan Narayan mentions that the Kerala connection to countries in the Persian Gulf predates the preeminence of Mumbai. It goes back to the Christian era, and even post the economic boom following the Yom Kippur War, the major part of migration to the Gulf went through the Dhaus, and most of them were illegal.
Yeah, absolutely. So I've written about this in my book. What I'm specifically talking about is labor migration in vast numbers. So you can look at the migration numbers from Kerala, and that starts picking up only after the oil crisis of 1973. That's when the numbers starts going from the hundreds to the thousands to the 10,000, and finally hundreds of thousands of Keralites. Okay, so that's what I mean in terms of, again, mass migration from Kerala to the Gulf, especially in construction and a variety of sectors, is a post-1973 phenomenon. But the early links of that can be traced to Bombay. So, I write this in my book. It's really interesting. When the first oil company, right, in that region struck oil, it just so happened that the guy who was charged of recruiting labor had happened to have spent his life as a PWD engineer in India. So he recruited the people he knew, which is Indian labor. And that's how the Indian connection to the oil company started. We're talking of early 20th century. Now those networks dissipated around the region as more oil companies came, and then Bombay became the head. I should also add, they had a recruiting rule that Muslims would be preferred because Gulf countries and so on. They had a rule that Christians would be preferred. They had an active anti-Hindu rule back then. Right? And as a result, in Bombay, a lot of the people, Christian and Muslims, happened to have a Kerala connection. So that's how that starting connection happened. Labor offices, contractual offices were set up in Bombay. And finally, their sub-offices were set up in Kerala. Finally, Bombay kind of went out of the picture, and Kerala, that network kind of scaled up in the 1970s. So that's what I was alluding to. But, you're absolutely right that the Gulf Kerala connections, thousands of years old. There's no doubt about it.
When you were talking about the migration numbers again, Pooja had referenced that people have also left in large numbers in the last 5 years. And also, in 1951, in Mekla's chart, is the 4.6% international migrants partition folks.
Yeah, that is the partition folks because of those 100,000 odd people from Sindhu. Yeah. And that's why it goes down after that. Yeah.
So Commander Mohan Narayan also asks, why is it that the migration from Madhya Pradesh was not that extensive compared to other states?
Yeah, great question. Simple answer is the geography, right? That is, how did Bombay start getting people from further from Maharashtra, Gujarat? Railways, yes, but you have to step back before the kind of railways era, because these parts, that is, the Gangetic, if you see the Gangetic plains, that is UP, Bihar, and then West Bengal, that navigation system was top class thanks to the rivers, right? So people, if you wanted to go to down south, you take the rivers and go down south. So that was a well-connected system, and that is why the first recruits for overseas migration were often taken from those parts via the port of Calcutta to places like Mauritius, to places like Fiji later on, to the Caribbean islands, to South Africa, all those places. So that recruitment network of labor started in the 19th century along the Gangetic Valley and a bit of Jharkhand, Chhattisgarh. Not Madhya Pradesh, because Madhya Pradesh was not in that geographic system. And that is why the recruitment system for indentured labor of India did not happen in Madhya Pradesh. As a result, this population was not exposed to these opportunities outside. And those networks matter hugely in migration. So when the railways was built, you might ask, yeah, now people from Madhya Pradesh should come. But the railways was built, but they were not looking to migrate because that exposure opportunity was not there. Whereas the culture of migration had already set in even before the railways in Eastern UP and Bihar. So when the railways came, this was now just a new economic opportunity. And as a migrant, you're saying, where do I get a better deal? Do I get a better deal in Mauritius or do I get a better deal in Bombay? Some people choose Bombay. The people who chose, by the way, happened to be Muslim weavers, this whole Julaha community. And that's why you have this place in Bombay called Madanpura. That's why you also have in Bhiwandi a neighborhood called Madanpura. Even Bhiwandi is a huge cluster today because of the same weaver migration that took place after the collapse of the cotton textile industry in Bombay. A lot of that has now moved to Bhiwandi. So that, I think, explains as to why Madhya Pradesh has not been a part of major out-migration streams of India. Not just Madhya Pradesh, the entire Deccan Plateau. Right? Why? Because it has been relatively cut off from the coasts. So it's in the plains connection with the coast where the opportunities to migrate first set in, and those networks are sustained. Things can, of course, change. And, in 30 years, people from Madhya Pradesh, you might find them everywhere. but it takes time for these networks to build up.
Yeah, so sticky networks is what it is all about. We have a question from Nikunj Harlanka, who says, which community migrated as a result of opium trade?
Sorry, can you repeat that? Yeah.
Which community migrated as a result of opium trade?
It's a good, I mean, any specific community, the Chinese. I mean, whatever little Chinese folks we found in Bombay was a clear connection with the opium trade, tea trade, and so on. But especially with opium. See, the Parsis had come before the opium trade, so you can't say like the Parsis came because of the opium trade. But the Parsis became wealthy because of the opium trade, right? A lot of Parsis made a lot of money because of the opium trade. Not just Parsis, but also Gujarati Hindus, Gujarati Jains, and so on. So a lot of Gujaratis, I would say, Gujarati migrants in Mumbai made a killing in the opium trade. What is the time period we're talking about? Roughly 1830s, 1850s. You know, that's like the golden age of 1820s to 1850s is the golden age of the opium trade. And of course, the leading merchant who strikes it very big is Jamshedji Jijiboy, right? And so, and the Sassoons also have some hand. So you should think of the two biggest names of 19th century business of Bombay is Jamshedji Jijiboy and Sassoon, and then later at the end, you know, J.N. Tata. And in that sense, they made a lot of money. Were there other communities that profited in Bombay per se? Well, you have to look at the entire supply chain. So maybe not in the direct selling of opium, but then, you know, everything associated. So the labor and so on, different communities would have had, you know, some success in that. But there's no doubt that a lot of money was generated for Bombay, right? And there's a whole book called Opium City by Amar Farooq.
There's an interesting question from Ray as to which is the biggest migrant community as of today?
In Bombay?
In Bombay.
So, I mean, so it depends on how large you define a community, right? If you look at language, and I see a question at the end on language, there's no doubt that the dominant language of the city is still Marathi, but you know, it's not over 50%. In most other cities, apart from Bangalore, and that's why Bangalore's, you know, diverse cosmopolitanism matters, Kannada is not the dominant language of the Bangalore urban agglomeration. But in most cities, the dominant language in Hindi, in Delhi and Hindi, Calcutta and Bengali, the dominant language is more than 80%. Right? In Bombay, it's pretty much never been, Marathi has never been more than 50%. And that's a huge thing. But definitely, if you think of community as linguistic groups, the Marathi speaking folks are the most dominant. Right? I mean, that's how you'd see it, followed by Gujarati and UP, right? So that's how you would see that. If you think about it in terms of maybe caste, as I pointed out, you know, 5 to 10% is what we would call a scheduled caste. But I can't think of any specific caste. The Marathas, definitely, right? Because of this Konkan connection. If you do a caste census of Bombay today, I would imagine that the Jati which would have the most would be the Marathas. And that is because of the Konkan connection. Just to give you a sense of the Konkan caste demography, it's roughly 70 to 80% Maratha, 10% everything else, and 10% Mahar. Right? So if you think of Konkan supplying the most amount of people for a long time to Bombay, the average person out there was Maratha, right? Maratha Kunbi, as the census would say. So that would be the dominant caste of Mumbai. And then what other community scale one can think of? In terms of neighborhoods, it's tough. You know, the census has never given us neighborhood information on communities. And that is why nowadays with Google Maps, you can play around. Right? So if you just type Sindhi in Mumbai, you can see all the places where Sindhi pops up in Mumbai. Right? If you type Udupi in Mumbai, you'll see all the Udupi restaurants in Mumbai. And that's a good proxy to see where these communities have come.
So, Vivek, has a question. What can you say about the interstate migration in the face of communal riots? Did it show up in trends like the Great Depression? And has it changed the demographics in cities?
Great question. There's no doubt that Bombay has always had an issue with riots, communal, non-communal, dog riots, variety of riots in Bombay's history. Did the segregation of residential areas in Bombay contribute to a more communally sensitive situation? It's tough to say, right? there's no doubt that in the cotton textile mills, there was a lot of shared solidarity because of the mills, because people would be seeing each other every day in the mills. Though they might have been staying on caste or religious lines, they were at least working in a common space. There was that shared sense of solidarity, which some people might say reduced the chances of communal riots and so on. But communal conflicts, unfortunately, have been an important part of Bombay's 20th century history. And to that sense, the fact that Bombay got so many people from so many places may have contributed to people feeling insecure and so on, right? But there's no doubt that I think politicians have unfortunately kind of amplified the situation in certain kind of decades, and on the one hand fighting for people's rights and so on, worker rights and so on, but at the same time playing on community identities, which have then added on to these rights. But when we say rights, communal rights, the more recent ones, for instance, there are clear locations of Bombay where those happen. And a lot of that was actually not migrant clusters. They were places where people have been living in Bombay now for more than 100 years, right? And so, is it that migration is causing these conflicts? I don't think so. I think it's something much more than that. Migrants are typically blamed for everything, but except for success, they're blamed for everything. So everything that goes wrong in a city, these migrants are destroying the city. And on that note, I should tell you that, in 1880s, I just came across a quip recently of the then head of Bombay lamenting about how many people are coming to Bombay, right? And we're talking about 1880s when Bombay's population was, about 500,000. And today we are at 12 million. So at different points of time, we think that there are too many people, but the fact is that the city has grown over time.
Last couple of questions. Bharat has a question whether Konkani Muslims were the dominating community amongst the Muslims in the city.
That seems to be the case in the 19th century, because as I told you, if I show you, let me on that note, I showed you that religion thing. Muslims have typically, if you look at Muslims' demography of Bombay, the data starts I think from 1881 or so. Till now, across census years, it has been roughly between 13 and 22%. It was actually 20% back then in the late 19th century. Then it actually fell, and then recently it has risen. So it's roughly been, let's say, in the 15 to 20% back. But the composition of the Muslims is completely different, because in the late 19th century, some of that, not all, but some of it was definitely Konkani Muslim. Today, however, the bulk of the Muslims in Bombay have a UP connection, right? UP Bihar. So that has changed. The composition of Muslims has definitely changed in terms of the regional stuff. And you're right that Konkani Muslims, did dominate. Of course, some of them are extremely wealthy, business people and so on. But it's tough to get an exact split of that number. How many from UP and how many from Konkan? But and then there's also the Gujarati Muslims, right, in Bombay, who are very important. So Konkani Muslims and Gujarati Muslims, I think that's how you should see pre-1901 Muslim population of Bombay. 20th century, almost complete switch towards UP Muslims.
Samir Palkar has made an observation that specifically the Bhandaris were prominent amongst the Marathas that we talked about. And of course, Commander Mohan Narayan says that the lingua franca of Bombay is Bombaya, and that's what combines everyone, to which Bharat has replied that Bombaya language is derived from a dialect of Konkani Muslims.
Interesting. Yeah, of course, there's a native bias out here when I say I love Mumbai, and that Mumbai is, but on every objective measure, Mumbai is India's most cosmopolitan city. However, it could become the second most cosmopolitan city after Bangalore in about 30 years' time, right? Because Bangalore, believe it or not, there was a recent article that showed the census 2011 showed more languages spoken in Bangalore than Mumbai, right? That is just a remarkable statistic. In terms of number of languages, that is more than 100 languages. But if you look at the concentration of languages, I'm sure Mumbai is much more diverse than Bangalore. So Mumbai is only, Bangalore is probably going to displace the cosmopolitan tag of Mumbai. But for about 200 years now, there's no doubt that Mumbai has always been. And that's something I think that should be treasured, because it I think enriches our life in a variety of ways. The amazing amount of food that we get, the amazing places that we get to see, different religious places or trading places, just a variety of things that make city life so much more fun.
There's been a barrage of compliments for the session, which I have not mentioned for paucity of time because we were so busy reading the answers. But there have been so many people who found your session amazing, and also found that this amazing that there is so much camaraderie in the city despite such a diverse migrant population. So I would say, amen to that, and hope that continues in the city and we continue to maintain our status as the most cosmopolitan city in the country. On that note, thank you very much, everyone. Thank you for.
Thanks so much. Yeah. Bye.